11th of March, 2026, the Persian Gulf. The Thai container vessel, Mayuri Nari, moves slowly through the Strait of Hormuz. The captain holds his heading precisely along the corridor. There is no room to deviate, not to the right, not to the left. 3 kilometers of permitted lane, 300 meters of steel beneath his feet, and the Iranian coastline sitting just a few miles off the starboard bow. The strike comes without warning. No alarm, no radio signal, just a flash near the stern and an immediate list. Within a minute, the superstructure is consumed by fire. The captain calls the evacuation. 20 crew members jump into the water and claw their way onto inflatable life rafts. They look back and watch their ship burn in the middle of the strait through which 20% of all the oil on the planet passes every single day. 3 members of the crew were never found. And now, the question that everyone in the world is asking in these days. The United States and Israel have just carried out the largest military operation in the Middle East in decades. The Iranian fleet has been decimated. The Air Force suppressed. The Supreme Leader is dead. The American Fifth Fleet stands in the region. And yet, 20% of the world's oil is not moving. More than 150 ships are frozen at anchor outside the strait, unwilling to enter. Traffic through the choke point has dropped by 70%. Why can't the most powerful military machine in the history of mankind open a corridor 34 kilometers wide? The answer is more complicated than it seems, and it changes everything you thought you knew about modern warfare. If you like my videos, please subscribe to my channel right now. We cover special operations, unsolved cases, and the events that the mainstream news cycle buries under the noise.
To understand why the strait is still closed, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the moment when everything began. The 28th of February, 2026. Before dawn, American and Israeli aircraft are already in the air. The operation has been given the name Epic Fury, and the name is not accidental. This is not a warning strike. This is not a demonstration of force. This is a systematic, pre-planned campaign to dismantle the Iranian military apparatus from the inside out. Strikes hit nuclear facilities, missile production sites, air defense systems, command centers, and naval infrastructure across the entire country simultaneously. In the first hours, Iran loses the ability to project coordinated military power in the traditional sense of the word. By the end of the first day, the picture looks unambiguous. The Iranian Air Force is largely grounded. The regular Navy, the Islamic Republic of Iran Navy, takes catastrophic losses in the Gulf of Oman. American destroyers, including USS Delbert D. Black, fire Tomahawk cruise missiles at Iranian military targets from positions in the Arabian Sea. Israeli aircraft operate in Iranian airspace. For anyone watching the operational map, it looks like a textbook demonstration of overwhelming force. And then, something happens that the operational map does not show. On the 2nd of March, just 4 days after the start of the campaign, a senior commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps appears on Iranian state media. His message is short. His language is direct. The strait is closed. Any vessel that attempts to pass will be set ablaze. The IRGC is not making a threat. It is making a declaration. And within hours, it begins making good on it. Here, it is important to understand one thing about Iran's military structure that most people outside defense circles do not know. Iran does not have one navy. It has 2. The first is the Artesh, the regular Islamic Republic of Iran Navy, responsible for operations beyond the Gulf and in the Gulf of Oman. The second is the IRGC Navy, the naval arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which, by a reorganization in 2007, was given sole operational responsibility for the Persian Gulf itself.
These two forces have historically competed with each other for resources, prestige, and influence. But in the Strait, when it comes to controlling shipping, it is the IRGC Navy that holds the cards. And the IRGC Navy had been preparing for exactly this moment for a very long time. The strikes of Operation Epic Fury degraded much of Iran's conventional military capacity. But the IRGC's coastal warfare infrastructure, its network of mobile missile launchers, drone launch platforms, fast attack boat bases, and command nodes buried into the rocky northern coastline of the Strait, was dispersed, hardened, and duplicated in ways that made it extraordinarily difficult to destroy completely in the opening days of a campaign. You can kill a fleet in a harbor. You cannot so easily kill 1,000 camouflaged positions along 40 kilometers of coastline. By the 4th of March, Iranian forces officially declared the strait closed. By the 8th of March, the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Center had confirmed 10 attacks on commercial vessels. Tankers were being hit while underway. Container ships were being struck at anchor. The Stena Imperative, a U.S.-flagged vessel, was hit twice in the port of Bahrain. A port. Not even in the strait itself, but in a harbor. One port worker was killed, 2 others were wounded. The numbers began to accumulate with a cold arithmetic. By the 12th of March, 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships in less than 2 weeks. The historical average for the strait is 138 vessel transits in a 24-hour period. By mid-March, that number had collapsed to single digits on most days. Some days, 0 tankers. The global oil market reacted instantly. Brent crude, which had been trading at $71.32 per barrel on the 27th of February, the day before the operation began, surged past $100 on the 8th of March. It climbed to a peak of $126 per barrel. European natural gas prices jumped nearly 50%. Asian gas markets rose by almost 40%. Qatar Energy, one of the world's largest LNG producers, halted production after its facilities were attacked. Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura refinery came under drone assault. The disruption was being described by energy analysts as the largest shock to global oil supply since the 1970s energy crisis. And yet, and this is the central paradox of everything that follows, the United States Navy was right there. 9 guided missile destroyers in the Arabian Sea, 3 littoral combat ships forward deployed to Bahrain, the most advanced naval air defense systems on Earth, satellites, reconnaissance aircraft, intelligence networks built over decades, and they could not simply sail in and reopen the strait. On the 3rd of March, President Trump posted a declaration on Truth Social that was unambiguous in its confidence. Effective immediately, he announced, the United States Development Finance Corporation would provide political risk insurance for maritime trade through the Gulf. If necessary, the United States Navy would begin escorting tankers through the Strait of Hormuz as soon as possible. No matter what, he wrote, the United States would ensure the free flow of energy to the world. The markets responded. Oil prices dipped slightly on the news. Shipping companies paused to see what would happen next. What happened next was not what anyone in those shipping companies wanted to hear. The following day, representatives of the U.S. Navy met in private with leaders of the shipping industry. The message delivered in that room was the precise opposite of what the president had posted publicly less than 24 hours earlier. There was, the Navy officials said, no chance of escorts happening anytime soon. The fleet was fully committed to offensive operations against Iranian military infrastructure. There were simply not enough assets available to simultaneously prosecute an air and naval campaign against Iran and protect commercial convoys through a narrow, heavily contested waterway where Iranian coastal missiles could reach a target in seconds. The gap between the presidential declaration and the operational reality was not a matter of political miscommunication. It was a precise measurement of something far more fundamental. The gap between what overwhelming military force can accomplish and what it cannot. America had won the battle, but the strait was still closed. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, acknowledged the situation at a Pentagon press briefing. He used careful language, describing the strait as a tactically complex environment. He confirmed that the Pentagon was working on options. He confirmed that the situation was being assessed. What he did not do was give a date. What he did not do was describe a clear path to reopening the waterway in the near term. Energy Secretary Chris Wright was somewhat more direct in an interview with CNBC. The Navy, he said, should be able to escort tankers through the strait by the end of March, but it could not happen now. All military assets, he explained, were focused on destroying Iran's offensive capabilities and the manufacturing infrastructure supplying them. The escort mission was real. It was coming, but it was not today. For the 40,000 sailors trapped aboard ships on both sides of the strait, half of them, according to the International Maritime Employers Council, effectively locked inside the Gulf with nowhere to go, the timeline offered cold comfort. They were living inside the tactical problem that the generals were describing from briefing rooms in Washington. They could see the Iranian coastline from their decks. Some of them were navigating without GPS, using radar alone, because Iranian electronic warfare systems were jamming satellite navigation across the entire zone. The Fujairah terminal, visible from the water, had been struck by Iranian attack drones and was burning off the starboard side of ships trying to exit the Gulf. Even the escape route was on fire.
And this brings us to the question that no military briefing had yet fully answered. Not the question of when, but the question of why. Why is it that the most sophisticated military force ever assembled, having just destroyed the Iranian Navy, grounded the Iranian Air Force, and killed the Iranian Supreme Leader, cannot force open a corridor of water 34 kilometers across? The answer begins with a map. And a map, in this case, tells a story that goes far deeper than geography. Most people, when they look at the Strait of Hormuz on a map, see a bottleneck, a narrow passage between two landmasses, something that looks, at first glance, like it could be forced open with enough naval power positioned at the right coordinates. That instinct is wrong, and understanding why it is wrong requires looking at the map more carefully, not as a geographic feature, but as a weapons system. The strait sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south. At its narrowest point, it is 34 kilometers wide. That sounds like a reasonable amount of space. The English Channel, for comparison, is 33 kilometers at its narrowest. Ships cross the channel constantly, in all weather, in all conditions. Nobody considers the channel a death trap. But the channel is not the strait, and the difference is not width. The difference is what sits on the banks. Under the International Maritime Traffic Separation Scheme, vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz do not use the full 34 kilometers. They use two designated shipping lanes, one for inbound traffic, one for outbound, each approximately 3 kilometers wide, separated by a 2-kilometer buffer zone. Outside those lanes, the water is too shallow for large vessels, or falls within the territorial waters of Iran or Oman in ways that create legal and navigational complications. In practice, a supertanker moving through the strait has about 3 kilometers of navigable corridor. A vessel that is 300 meters long, and the largest crude carriers are longer than that, has almost no ability to maneuver within that corridor. It cannot accelerate meaningfully. It cannot turn sharply. It cannot take evasive action of any kind that would matter against a missile traveling at several hundred meters per second. The tanker is, for all practical purposes, a fixed target, moving at a fixed speed along a fixed path that every party in the region has known about for decades. Now look at where that path runs relative to the Iranian coastline. The inbound shipping lane, the one tankers use when entering the Persian Gulf, runs along the northern edge of the strait, which is the Iranian edge.
At points, the lane passes within a few kilometers of Iranian territory.
The coastal mountains and the Iranian shore create a geographic funnel that forces large vessels directly beneath Iranian firing positions. A surface-to-surface missile, launched from a coastal battery on the Iranian side, does not need to travel far. It does not need sophisticated guidance to find a 300-meter target moving in a straight line at 15 knots. It needs seconds. The crew of the target vessel has no meaningful window to react. The naval escort sailing alongside has a reaction time measured in single-digit seconds. General Dan Kane, in his Pentagon briefing, did not use dramatic language about this. He used the phrase, tactically complex environment. That is the military vocabulary for a situation where the geometry of the battlefield inherently favors the attacker on shore, regardless of the overall balance of forces. The strait is tactically complex because physics makes it so. You cannot change the width of the water. You cannot move the Iranian coastline. You cannot give a supertanker the maneuverability of a destroyer. And Iran has spent decades understanding this geometry and building around it. Before Operation Epic Fury began, Iran was estimated to possess between 6,000 and 8,000 naval mines, a stockpile built specifically for use in the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf. Mines are extraordinarily effective in shallow water because the pressure waves from an explosion have nowhere to dissipate. The Gulf, in most places, is less than 35 meters deep. A mine detonating beneath a tanker in 30 meters of water transfers almost the full force of the blast directly into the hull. Retired Captain Glenn Allen, former commander of Mine Countermeasures Squadron 5 at US 5th Fleet, was blunt about this during the crisis. The mines Iran possesses are not the most technically advanced in the world, but they are more than sufficient to cause serious damage to any vessel that strikes one. But here is where the current crisis reveals something strategically significant that most coverage has missed. Iran is not using mines as its primary weapon against shipping. Iran is using missiles. This is not a tactical accident. It is a deliberate, strategic choice. And the reason for that choice tells you something important about what Iran is actually trying to accomplish. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Kane, confirmed at his March briefing that Iran has been using surface-to-surface missiles to attack shipping in the northern part of the strait. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stated publicly that there was no clear evidence of active mining. The US military destroyed more than 30 Iranian mine-laying vessels in the early days of the operation, and Iran responded by switching to smaller boats that are harder to target. But the primary weapon against commercial traffic remained the missile and the drone. The reason, as analyst Nicholas Carl of the American Enterprise Institute's Critical Threats Project explained, is control. Mines do not discriminate. A mine placed in the shipping lane will detonate under any vessel that passes, Iranian, Chinese, friendly, hostile. A missile can be aimed. A missile can be withheld. A missile gives the operator the ability to choose which ships burn and which ships pass. And Iran is exercising that choice with precision. Ships with documented links to China have been transiting. A Pakistani tanker passed through in early March. Indian liquefied petroleum gas carriers moved through the lane, broadcasting their positions openly, a signal that they had, in some form, received clearance. These vessels hugged Iranian territorial waters rather than using the international lanes, following paths that would normally be considered navigational hazards, but they arrived safely. The pattern was clear enough that maritime analysts were describing it openly. Iran had created a selective blockade. Not a physical barrier, but a permission system. Certain countries, certain relationships, certain geopolitical alignments were being rewarded with access. Everyone else was being burned. The asymmetry of cost in this system is staggering. An Iranian Shahed series attack drone costs somewhere in the range of $20,000 to $50,000 to produce. The tanker it strikes is worth hundreds of millions. The cargo aboard, crude oil bound for refineries in South Korea or Japan or the Netherlands, is worth tens of millions more. The disruption to the shipping schedule,
the insurance claim, the replacement of the vessel. These costs cascade outward through the entire supply chain in ways that are genuinely difficult to calculate. One strike produces economic damage orders of magnitude larger than the cost of the weapon that caused it.
On the defensive side, the mathematics run in exactly the opposite direction. An American Patriot interceptor missile costs approximately $4 million. A THAAD interceptor costs approximately $12 million. These are the systems used to defend against Iranian ballistic and cruise missiles, targeting bases and infrastructure across the Gulf. Every Iranian missile that is intercepted costs the United States defense budget between $4 and $12 million. Every Iranian drone that is shot down costs somewhere between $1 and $4 million in interceptors. Defense analysts covering the conflict were explicit about this arithmetic. Iran does not need to win every exchange. Iran needs only to make every exchange expensive enough that the cumulative cost becomes politically and economically untenable. And then there is the escort problem specifically. CNN's military analysts ran the numbers during the second week of the crisis. The U.S. has 73 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers on active duty, but only approximately 68% of U.S. surface ships are combat-ready at any given time, accounting for maintenance cycles, training rotations, and refit schedules. That brings the available number down to roughly 50 destroyers, dispersed across every ocean on the planet. A single escort mission through the strait would require somewhere between 7 and 10 destroyers to provide adequate air cover and surface defense for a small convoy of 3 or 4 commercial vessels. That means one convoy mission consumes 20% of the entire available U.S. destroyer force. That is for one convoy, moving 3 or 4 ships. The historical daily transit rate through the strait is 138 vessels. Even at 10% of that rate, the optimistic estimate analysts were using in mid-March, you would need escorts for nearly 14 ships per day. The numbers simply do not add up for the U.S. Navy operating alone, which is precisely why President Trump began calling on allies to contribute naval forces to a collective effort. France announced the creation of a Hormuz coalition. The UK pointed to autonomous mine-hunting systems already pre-positioned in the region. European frigates began moving toward the eastern Mediterranean. But coalition naval operations in a confined, contested waterway under active fire from shore-based missiles are not assembled in days. And then there were the escape routes. Saudi Arabia was diverting crude through the east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. The UAE had activated the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline to Fujairah on the Arabian Sea coast. These pipelines represented the primary physical alternative to the Hormuz route. But the numbers told their own story. The combined pipeline capacity was 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. The daily flow through the strait before the crisis was 20 million barrels. The pipelines could replace at most 27% of normal traffic. The rest had nowhere to go. And on the 3rd of March, Iranian attack drones struck the Fujairah terminal, the only major UAE export point that bypassed the strait entirely. The port of Duqm in Oman was hit the same day. The escape routes were being closed behind the ships as they tried to use them. By mid-March, Iraq had already cut oil production by 1.5 million barrels per day, not because of direct strikes, but because storage tanks were filling up with crude that had nowhere to go. The clock was running. And there was something else stopping ships, something that appeared in no Pentagon briefing and on no radar screen, something that was, in many ways, more powerful than any missile Iran had fired. It had no warhead. It traveled no faster than an email, and it was quietly strangling the strait more effectively than any weapon in Iran's arsenal. There is a document that sits at the center of every commercial voyage on Earth. It is not a navigation chart. It is not a cargo manifest. It is not a flag registration certificate. It is an insurance policy.
And in the Strait of Hormuz crisis of 2026, that document, or rather the absence of it, turned out to be more effective at stopping ships than any missile Iran had fired. To understand how this works, you need to understand a corner of the financial world that almost nobody outside the shipping industry ever thinks about. It is called Protection and Indemnity Insurance, P&I for short. Every commercial vessel operating in international waters is required to carry it. P&I covers third-party liability, the costs that arise when something goes wrong at sea, damage to a port facility, environmental cleanup after a spill, compensation for injured or killed crew members,
cargo loss claims. The sums involved are enormous. A single incident involving a very large crude carrier can generate liability in the hundreds of millions of dollars. No shipowner operates without this coverage. It is the financial foundation on which the entire global shipping industry rests. On top of P&I, vessels operating in high-risk areas require what is called war risk insurance. This is separate coverage that specifically addresses the possibility of the ship being damaged or destroyed by military action, terrorism, or armed conflict. Under normal conditions, war risk premiums are a modest line item in a vessel's operating budget. When a region is declared a war zone, those premiums can increase by factors of 4, 5, or 10 overnight. And there is a clause embedded in most war risk policies that the shipping industry had been quietly watching for years, knowing that one day it would matter enormously. It is called the 72-hour cancellation clause. It gives insurers the right to cancel war risk coverage on short notice when a conflict breaks out in a covered area. The rationale is straightforward. Insurers need the ability to recalibrate their exposure when conditions change suddenly. The practical effect in a crisis is that coverage can vanish almost instantaneously. That is exactly what happened in the first days of March 2026. Within 48 hours of Iran's declaration that the strait was closed, the major P&I clubs and war risk underwriters began exercising those cancellation clauses. Lloyd's of London market syndicates adjusted their coverage terms for the entire Persian Gulf region. The Joint War Committee, the body of London insurance underwriters that designates high-risk maritime zones, placed the entire Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and surrounding waters on its listed areas, triggering automatic premium escalations across the market. The war risk premium for a voyage through the strait jumped to somewhere between 0.5% and 1% of the vessel's insured value per transit within days. On a very large crude carrier insured at $150 million, that means a single transit now costs between $750,000 and $1.5 million in war risk premium alone for one voyage. Add crew welfare bonuses required under maritime labor agreements for vessels entering declared war zones, the additional salary supplements required by the International Transport Workers Federation, and the economics of a single transit became, for most operators, impossible to justify. Maersk suspended all transits. CMAC GM followed. Hapag-Lloyd announced it was rerouting vessels away from the entire region. These are three of the largest container shipping companies on the planet. When they stop, the effects are felt immediately in every port, every warehouse, every supply chain that depends on the movement of goods through the Gulf. Bloomberg's reporting during the second week of the crisis captured the scale of the collapse. Fewer than 100 commercial ships had crossed the strait since the 1st of March, compared to a normal rate of 138 ships in a single 24-hour period. And of those few ships that did transit, approximately 1 in 5 switched off their automatic identification system transponders as they passed through, going what the maritime industry calls dark, invisible to civilian tracking systems, navigating without broadcasting their position. Going dark is itself a measure of desperation. AIS transponders exist for safety. They are how ships know where other ships are in congested waterways. Turning them off increases the risk of collision. Captains who ordered their crews to go dark were making a calculated bet that the risk of invisibility to other vessels was preferable to the risk of being a trackable target for Iranian missile systems.
Some of them were also navigating without GPS, using radar alone, because Iranian electronic warfare systems were actively jamming satellite navigation across the entire zone. The 40,000 seafarers trapped on both sides of the strait were living inside this calculation every day. Half of them were effectively locked inside the Persian Gulf with no safe way out. The benchmark earnings for an oil tanker in the Middle East had climbed to approximately $200,000 per day above pre-war levels, meaning that for ship owners willing to accept the risk, the potential profits were extraordinary. But the insurance market had largely decided that no premium was high enough to make the risk acceptable on a systematic basis. This is the invisible weapon. Not a missile,
Not a mine, a spreadsheet, a risk model, a decision made in an office in London or Oslo or Tokyo that a particular voyage represented an exposure that no rational insurer would underwrite at any commercially viable price. Iran did not need to sink every ship that tried to pass. It needed only to sink enough of them to create enough visible, documented, photographed destruction that the global insurance market's models shifted. One burning tanker, photographed by satellite and broadcast worldwide, changes the risk calculus for every other vessel in the region instantaneously. The Mayuri Nari, burning in the middle of the strait on the 11th of March, was not just an attack on one ship. It was a data point that rippled through every underwriting desk in London, Singapore, and New York within hours. And the data point said, "This is real. This is happening. The models have to change." The United States tried to address this directly. President Trump announced that the Development Finance Corporation would provide political risk insurance for maritime trade through the Gulf. If private insurers would not cover the risk, the US government would backstop it. It was a significant commitment, but implementation was not instantaneous. Shipping companies needed legal certainty about terms, clarity on claims processes, time to review the offer with lawyers and risk managers. Meanwhile, the attacks continued. Meanwhile, the insurance market continued to harden. Meanwhile, ships sat at anchor outside the strait and waited. Iraq's situation was becoming critical. The country had already cut oil production by 1.5 million barrels per day, not because of direct military action against Iraqi infrastructure, but because storage tanks inside the Gulf were approaching capacity. When there is nowhere to send oil, you stop pumping it. JP Morgan's head of global commodities research had already warned that if Gulf producers exhausted their storage capacity entirely, they would be forced into production shutdowns that could send Brent crude to $120 per barrel. The United States authorized a drawdown of 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve over 4 months as part of a coordinated International Energy Agency release of 400 million barrels globally. It provided some cushion. It did not solve the problem. The United Nations Security Council passed a resolution demanding that Iran stop attacks on regional neighbors and end the threats to maritime routes. 135 countries co-sponsored it. China and Russia abstained. The resolution passed. The attacks continued. Senate Democrats who had received classified briefings began speaking publicly about what they described as an absence of clear goals and a lack of planning for reopening the strait. Senator Chris Murphy warned of what he called an endless war scenario. Defense Secretary Hegseth said the United States would not allow what he called terrorists to hold the strait hostage. But the strait was, in practice, being held hostage. And the hostage was not a military objective. The hostage was the global economy. The invisible weapon works because it operates in a domain, financial risk, where military power has no direct leverage. You can sink an Iranian frigate, you can destroy a missile battery, you can clear a minefield. But you cannot bomb an insurance company's risk model back to where it was before the first tanker burned. You cannot threaten a Lloyd's syndicate into underwriting a voyage that its actuaries have assessed as commercially unacceptable. You cannot order a shipping company's board to send their vessels into a zone where they might lose them.
And Iran knew this. It had known it for a long time. On the 9th of March, 2026, Iran's Assembly of Experts announced the appointment of a new supreme leader. His name was Mojtaba Khamenei, 56 years old, mid-ranking cleric, a man who had never held a formal government position in his life, yet had operated for decades as one of the most powerful shadow figures inside the Islamic Republic. He was the second son of the leader who had just been killed. He had served in the IRGC during the Iran-Iraq War. He had helped orchestrate the crackdown on the Green Movement protests in 2009. He had the full backing of the Revolutionary Guard. And he had spent his entire career working from behind a curtain, pulling threads that nobody outside Iran's inner circle could see. 3 days later, on the 12th of March, his first statement as supreme leader reached the world. Not through a public appearance, not through a broadcast speech. A written message, read aloud by a state television anchor while a still photograph was displayed on screen. Mojtaba Khamenei had not been seen in public since the opening strikes of Operation Epic Fury. Reports were circulating in international media that he had suffered injuries. But the content of that statement, delivered in his absence, was unambiguous. The Strait of Hormuz would remain closed, not as a temporary measure, not as a bargaining chip to be exchanged for a ceasefire, as a permanent instrument of pressure on the enemy, a weapon to be wielded for as long as the Islamic Republic judged it necessary. The strait was not a geographic feature that Iran was attempting to blockade. It was a lever, and Iran's hand was on that lever. The oil markets responded within minutes. Brent crude moved sharply upward. Insurance brokers in London began fielding calls from tanker operators, asking whether anything had changed. Nothing had changed. But to understand why Mojtaba Khamenei could issue that statement with confidence, why a country whose supreme leader had just been killed, whose conventional navy had been largely destroyed, whose air force had been grounded, could still announce that the strait would stay closed, you have to understand the strategic logic that Iran had been building toward for decades. A logic that did not depend on winning a conventional military exchange. A logic that depended on something else entirely. Iran's strategy in the strait has never been about defeating the United States Navy in open battle. The Iranian military leadership has never believed that was possible. What they calculated, over years of planning and simulation, was something more precise. They did not need to defeat the US Navy. They needed only to make the cost of operating in the strait high enough that the global commercial system would do the rest of the work for them. This is sometimes called a strategy of asymmetric exhaustion. The logic runs as follows. The United States can project overwhelming conventional force into almost any theater on Earth, but projecting that force is extraordinarily expensive, in money, in assets, in political capital. The question Iran asked was not, can we defeat this force? The question was, can we make operating in this environment cost more than the benefits justify? Can we make the water expensive enough that the world decides on its own to stop sailing through it? The answer, in March of 2026, appeared to be yes. Consider what Iran had actually done to close the strait. It had not mined the waterway comprehensively. It had not deployed its surface fleet in a conventional blocking formation. Most of that fleet had been destroyed in the opening days of Epic Fury. It had not launched a massive coordinated missile barrage that overwhelmed American air defenses. What it had done was this. It had fired enough missiles and drones at enough commercial vessels in a consistent enough pattern that the global insurance market had recalculated the risk of the strait and decided that risk was unacceptable at any commercially viable premium. 21 confirmed attacks in less than 2 weeks. Not every attack had been catastrophic, but the cumulative effect, the aggregate signal sent to every risk model in every underwriting office in every financial center on Earth had been sufficient. The strait was not physically blocked. It was economically blocked. And those are two fundamentally different problems. A physical blockade can, in principle, be broken by force. You remove the mines. You destroy the missile batteries.
You escort the commercial traffic through the cleared corridor. This is what naval power is designed to do. The United States Navy has the capability to do exactly this, and the planning for the escort mission was proceeding precisely along these lines, with a target date at the end of March for the first convoys to begin moving. But an economic blockade, one that exists not in the water, but in the risk models of insurance companies and the board decisions of shipping corporations, does not yield to the same remedy. Clearing the mines does not automatically restore insurance coverage. Destroying the coastal missile batteries does not immediately rebuild the confidence of shipping executives whose legal obligation is to their shareholders and whose vessels are their primary assets. The insurance market moves fast in one direction, toward restriction, toward cancellation, toward elevated premiums, and it moves slowly in the other. Trust, once broken by satellite images of burning tankers, is not restored by a Pentagon press briefing. And Iran had one more card to play, the card that revealed most clearly the full sophistication of the strategy. China was still moving tankers through the strait. Not loudly, not brazenly, but consistently, with a pattern that analysts had identified by the second week of the crisis. Chinese-linked vessels, some flying the Chinese flag, others with documented ownership connections to Chinese state enterprises, were transiting the lane. They hugged Iranian territorial waters, following paths that passed closer to the Iranian coast than any international navigation guide would recommend. They broadcast their AIS signals openly, a visible demonstration that they had been cleared to pass. Pakistani tankers moved through. Indian liquefied petroleum gas carriers moved through, their transponders on. The pattern was not random. It was a deliberate policy choice by Iran to use its control of the strait not just as a weapon against the United States and its allies, but as a diplomatic instrument, a tool for rewarding alignment and punishing opposition. Iran was running a toll booth. The toll was not money. The toll was geopolitical positioning. Countries that had not joined the US-led coalition against Iran, countries that had maintained economic relationships with Tehran, these countries could move their oil. Everyone else waited. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent made an observation during a media briefing that was more revealing than perhaps intended. He noted that Iranian and Chinese-flagged tankers were still transiting, evidence, in his view, that the strait had not been comprehensively mined, since mines do not discriminate by flag. He was correct. But the observation also illuminated the deeper logic. Iran was not trying to close the strait to everyone. Iran was trying to close it selectively, to create a controlled choke point that could be administered, adjusted, and used as leverage in ways that a minefield never could. Turkey, Egypt, India, and Pakistan had all approached Tehran requesting that Iran stop the attacks on commercial shipping. The response was firm. Security, Tehran replied, would be for everyone or for no one. This was not the behavior of a country that had been defeated. This was the behavior of a country that had lost a conventional military engagement and emerged from it holding a strategic position its adversaries could not easily dislodge. And here is the final paradox, the one that makes the 2026 crisis genuinely different from any previous episode of Middle Eastern military confrontation. In every previous conflict involving the strait, in the tanker war of the 1980s, in the Iranian harassment campaigns of the 2000s and 2010s, the implicit assumption was that the United States held ultimate escalation dominance, that if Iran pushed hard enough, the United States could push back harder, and Iran would ultimately yield. The asymmetry of raw military power would eventually reassert itself. That assumption had not been disproven in 2026. The United States still possessed overwhelming conventional military superiority, but what the crisis revealed was that conventional military superiority, even when exercised at scale, does not automatically translate into the ability to control the economic consequences of a conflict in a globally integrated commercial system. The strait was not a military objective in the traditional sense. It was a node in a network,
a network of shipping lanes, insurance markets, commodity exchanges, corporate risk assessments, sovereign energy dependencies, and geopolitical alignments that extended to every economy on Earth. Controlling that node required not just military presence, but economic confidence. And economic confidence could not be restored by destroying missile batteries. It had to be earned back slowly, through a sustained period of demonstrated safety that the insurance actuaries would eventually incorporate into their models. The analysts who estimated that even a successful convoy operation would restore at most 10% of pre-war traffic levels were not being pessimistic. They were being mathematically precise about the relationship between military action and commercial confidence in a world where the two things are connected but not identical. Iran had lost its supreme leader. It had lost most of its conventional navy. It had lost significant portions of its air defense network, its missile production infrastructure, its nuclear research facilities. The human and material cost of Operation Epic Fury was enormous and undeniable. But Iran had also demonstrated something that no amount of military power could easily refute: that a country willing to accept devastating conventional losses could still, through a carefully calibrated campaign of economic disruption, impose costs on the global system entirely disproportionate to its conventional military strength. That the leverage embedded in geography, in the geological fact that the Persian Gulf has only one exit, was a strategic asset that survived even a catastrophic conventional military defeat. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 2 3-kilometer shipping lanes, 34 kilometers of water between Iran and Oman. On a map, it looks like something that should take about 30 minutes to resolve. It had brought the global oil market to its knees in under 2 weeks. Not because Iran had a weapon that could defeat the United States Navy, but because Iran had a weapon that the United States Navy was not designed to defeat. The weapon was not a missile, it was not a mine, it was not a drone. It was the mathematics of risk, the cold, indifferent arithmetic of insurance actuaries and corporate risk managers and shipping company boards, all of them making individually rational decisions that collectively produced an outcome that no military operation, however successful, could simply override. You cannot bomb a risk model. You cannot sink an insurance policy. You cannot threaten a spreadsheet into changing its numbers. And until the numbers change, until the actuaries decide that the strait is safe enough, and the shipping companies decide that the insurance is affordable enough, and the crews decide that the route is survivable enough, the water will stay empty.
That is the lesson of the Strait of Hormuz. And it is a lesson that every strategist, every defense planner, every policymaker who believes that military power is the ultimate answer to every geopolitical problem would do well to study carefully. Because the next choke point is already on the map, and the mathematics will be the same.